The plane came down with no one alive at the controls, no hijacker, no explosion, and no sign of struggle. But before it crashed, fighter pilots looked through its windows and saw something impossible, an airliner full of motionless people, still flying itself. By the end, you'll know how one small cockpit mistake turned an ordinary flight into a silent airborne tomb, why the crew misunderstood every warning they received, and who entered the cockpit when everyone else was already beyond saving. On the morning of August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 departed Cyprus for Prague, with a scheduled stop in Athens. There were 121 people aboard. At first, nothing looked unusual. The Boeing 737 climbed over the Mediterranean under a clear summer sky. Air traffic controllers issued routine instructions. The crew responded normally. Then, the voices stopped. As the aircraft climbed through 16,000 feet, controllers repeatedly called the cockpit. No answer. The plane continued upward, leveled near 34,000 feet, and followed its programmed route toward Athens with mechanical precision. That detail mattered. This wasn't an aircraft tumbling out of control. It wasn't turning toward a secret destination. It wasn't broadcasting demands. It was behaving exactly like a healthy passenger jet, except no human being inside appeared willing or able to speak. Controllers tried different frequencies. Other aircraft attempted contact. Nothing came back. When Flight 522 reached Athens, it entered the airport's holding pattern and began circling. Round after round, an airliner carrying 121 people traced the same path through the sky. Greek authorities now had to consider the darkest possibility of that era, hijacking. 2 fighter jets were ordered into the air. The fighter pilots intercepted the aircraft shortly before noon. They approached cautiously, expecting a damaged cockpit, armed attackers, or some visible emergency. Instead, they found silence. Through the cockpit windows, they could see the captain's seat was empty. The first officer remained in his seat, slumped motionless over the controls. In the passenger cabin, oxygen masks hung from the ceiling. The people beneath them appeared unconscious. There was no panic. No fighting. No one pounding on the windows. The plane was flying on autopilot. Imagine that view from the fighter beside it, engines running, wings level, sunlight flashing across the fuselage, while every visible person inside seemed frozen in place. Then the scene changed. A figure entered the cockpit. He wasn't one of the pilots. He sat at the controls and appeared to study the instruments. The fighter pilot tried to attract his attention. For several agonizing minutes, there was no clear response. Then the figure finally noticed the jet outside. He raised a hand, and waved. That gesture suggested someone aboard was still conscious. But before we get to who he was, you need to understand something even stranger. The disaster had announced itself almost 2 hours earlier. The crew simply misunderstood what the aircraft was trying to tell them. Minutes after takeoff, an alarm sounded inside Flight 522's cockpit. The pilots recognized the tone. Or at least, they thought they did. The same warning sound on that model of aircraft could indicate 2 very different problems. On the ground, it warned that the plane was incorrectly configured for takeoff. In the air, it warned that cabin pressure was becoming dangerously low. The aircraft was already airborne, so the meaning should have been clear. But the crew became convinced they were dealing with a faulty takeoff configuration warning. That assumption trapped them. While they searched for an electrical or cooling problem, the air inside the cabin grew thinner. A master caution light illuminated. Passenger oxygen masks deployed automatically. Still, the pilots never reported a loss of cabin pressure. A company engineer contacted the captain by radio and asked a crucial question: was the pressurization panel set to automatic? There was no useful answer. Behind the pilots, on the overhead panel, one small selector remained in the wrong position. It had been left on manual. And because it was on manual, the aircraft wasn't properly regulating cabin pressure as it climbed. The emergency was not hidden behind some elaborate mechanical failure. It was visible above their heads. But oxygen deprivation was already changing what their brains could understand. Hypoxia doesn't always feel like suffocation. That's what makes it so dangerous. As oxygen decreases, your judgment can fail before you realize anything is wrong. You may feel confused, tired, strangely calm, even euphoric. Simple tasks become difficult. Obvious information stops looking obvious. And the higher the aircraft climbs, the less time you have to act. The pilots were trying to diagnose the plane while their own ability to reason was disappearing. They focused on equipment cooling. They discussed circuit breakers. They chased the problem through the cockpit as if it were a puzzle. But the puzzle was solving them. At roughly 18,000 feet, the passenger masks had dropped. Those masks were never designed to keep everyone conscious indefinitely. They provide a temporary oxygen supply, enough time for pilots to descend to breathable air. Flight 522 never descended. It continued climbing. When the passengers' oxygen supply ran out, the cabin remained at an altitude where consciousness could not be maintained. One by one, the people aboard slipped deeper into oxygen deprivation. There was no mass struggle because there was no visible attacker. The killer was the atmosphere itself. An autopilot kept carrying them toward Athens, long after the cockpit had fallen silent. The figure seen by the fighter pilots was 25-year-old flight attendant Andreas Prodromou. He had something most people aboard did not: scuba diving experience and a commercial pilot's license. Investigators concluded that he likely remained conscious by using portable oxygen cylinders from the cabin. Somehow, he made his way through the silent aircraft and entered the cockpit. By then, Flight 522 had been airborne for nearly 3 hours. The captain had apparently left his seat before losing consciousness. The first officer was incapacitated. Prodromou was now facing an unfamiliar cockpit at cruising altitude, surrounded by alarms, instruments, and 2 fighter jets. He was trained to fly smaller aircraft, not a Boeing 737. And he arrived almost impossibly late. As the fighter pilot watched, the left engine stopped. The aircraft had exhausted fuel from one wing tank. Prodromou appeared to attempt control. A faint Mayday transmission was later recovered from the cockpit recording, but the radio was tuned to the wrong frequency. No controller heard him. He was alive. He was trying. And from the ground, he was still completely silent. Here is the final reveal. Flight 522 was not brought down by a bomb, hijacker, or mysterious weapon. A maintenance test had required engineers to place the pressurization system in manual mode. The test was completed, but the selector was not returned to automatic. The pilots failed to notice its position during their checks. After takeoff, they misidentified the cabin altitude warning. As hypoxia impaired them, the window for recovery closed. The autopilot did exactly what it had been programmed to do. It climbed, navigated to Athens, entered the holding pattern, and continued circling until fuel ran low. The left engine failed first. Prodromou remained inside the cockpit as the aircraft began descending. Minutes later, the right engine stopped too. The plane glided toward the hills north of Athens and struck the ground. All 121 people aboard were killed. What looked like a ghost flight was actually a chain of ordinary failures: one switch, one missed check, one misunderstood alarm, and an automated system continuing long after the humans it served could no longer intervene. The official investigation found no single cinematic villain. That may be the most unsettling part. The aircraft was flyable. The engines worked until the fuel ran out. The autopilot performed correctly. Even the initial pressurization problem could have been fixed with a selector movement, or escaped with an immediate emergency descent. But disasters rarely wait for one enormous mistake. They build themselves from small assumptions. A switch left behind after maintenance. A checklist item missed. An alarm interpreted through the wrong mental model. A technical conversation continuing while the people involved slowly lose the ability to think. Following the crash, investigators and safety authorities pushed for clearer procedures, improved training, and better differentiation between cockpit warnings. Because Flight 522 exposed a brutal contradiction in modern aviation. A plane can remain perfectly capable of flying while everyone aboard becomes incapable of saving it. The machine did not know it was carrying the dead and dying. It only knew its programmed route. So it kept flying. For hours, the world watched what appeared to be an impossible aircraft, a passenger jet circling normally with no functioning crew. But the truth was more frightening than any conspiracy. Nothing supernatural had taken control. Nothing had taken control at all. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. And next time, a photo from 1941 shows a man in modern clothing. No one can explain it.